everybody. Thank you for being patient and joining me for this panel on how to survive an extinction, based all around my book, The Last Days of the Dinosaurs. So my name is Riley Black. My pronouns are she, they. And without further ado, I'm just going to get into it. So I'm going to share my screen so I can do a little slideshow for you. So when we think about non-avian dinosaurs, when we think about the Mesozoic and all these wonderful things, so much of what we know is being drawn from the fossil record, drawn from bones, teeth, tracks, all the wonderful fossils and traces that these creatures left behind. And it leaves a lot of room for imagination. In some ways, we would not think about dinosaurs or be as excited about them as we are now if there hadn't been a mass extinction 66 million years ago. I mean, the fact is that dinosaurs are still with us. We've got birds. Birds are living dinosaurs, and I get into, why birds survived, a little bit later in this talk. But even though I know many of us are big bird fans and bird watchers, and we love our feathered friends, the fact is they also seem a little bit familiar and they seem a little bit plain. So even outside the weirdness of dinosaurs and how large so many of them were, the fact is if we still had non-avian dinosaurs around today, we'd probably think of them similar to deer and things like that we see around us. We would have evolved to live with them, but they're all gone. Out of more than 150 million years, even the time that they originated at the beginning of the Triassic, through the extinction at the end of the Cretaceous. That's a huge span of time. There has been more time, as been said, repeatedly, between Stegosaurus and T-Rex. More than 80 million years between those two. It's only been 66 million years since that asteroid strike that changed everything. So we are still very much living in the shadow of this mass extinction. The amount of time that's been in the Cenozoic is only a fraction of the amount of time that non-avian dinosaurs were beginning to evolve and thrive as part of this Mesozoic world, because it's something we'll be talking a little bit about through this program. But it didn't only affect the dinosaurs. There were mass extinctions of mammals, there were mass extinctions of birds and lizards, things in the sea, groups of organisms that usually we don't talk about at all. You really only know about if you're a specialist. Like rudists, these giant, basically toilet seat-like clams that were reef builders, entirely disappeared at the end of the Cretaceous. And even though that might not be as exciting as T-Rex and Triceratops, you know that's a whole ecosystem component. These are creatures that made in other environments. This is about interconnection. You take one piece out or a whole chunk out and everything changes. So the world as we know it today, it's not as if flowering plants or ecosystems as we know them would continue to flourish in this kind of same sort of way. This mass extinction set up the world that we know around us. And if you pardon me for 1 second, I'm going to open the door because my little boy Hobbs here is meowing to go see his other mom. It's always one that sneaks in. So when we reconstruct dinosaurs and other forms of prehistoric life, we're trying to bring the best science that we possibly can, but there's always room for imagination. This is a statue of Sue the T-Rex, that's part of the Traveling Sue exhibit, and it was one of two life-size T-Rexes that were around, at the time. The other was Ultimate T-Rex that the AMNH did, and this one, Sue's, this is a thick Tyrannosaur. This is a relatively chunky Tyrannosaur, not really proto-feathers on it, a lot of detail on the scales. Kind of has the updated lips, very scientifically accurate modern T-Rex. But the one that the AMNH did, it kind of looks like an orange Muppet. It's got this mane of proto-feathers. Its arms look a little bit different. Its build is a little bit different. And so you have in the same year two major institutions creating entirely different visions of the same famous animal. And we all have our own picture in our head of what we think T-Rex would have looked like and how they would have behaved. For my own part, I got in touch with artist Kory who did all the illustrations that you're going to see from here on out. And this is our version of a T-Rex for the last days of the dinosaurs, and that I more or less see in my head. I like a fluffy T-Rex, and my version is just as scientifically based and defensible as many other iterations. And that's part of the fun of this, is that because we have this gap in the fossil record, because we have this gap of 66 million years, between us, and in that moment, we can really match science and imagination to come with a picture of what life was like. And this is really something that I think we take for granted now, but it's taken decades to get to this point. The word dinosaur itself was coined in 1842. People have been finding dinosaur bones and tracks for thousands of years before that. There are places around the world, one about 4 hours away from where I'm sitting right now. So I'm in Salt Lake City, on the sort of outskirts of Zion National Park. There are petroglyphs associated with dinosaur tracks, and some of them look like dinosaur tracks. So indigenous peoples were basically noticing, interpreting, understanding fossils um, long before paleontology was a science, long before we even had the word dinosaur. And even when we had a concept of what dinosaurs might be, and these terrible lizards, their look has changed so much for the past 200 years. Um, what we think they are has fundamentally shifted from decade to decade. And through all this time, early on, there wasn't a mystery of where the dinosaurs went. They seemed to be these big weird reptiles, things like giant iguanas or giant crocodiles, that just disappeared because that was part of life's progression. Charles Darwin was not the first person to come up with the idea of evolution. He was not the first person to have an evolutionary theory. Lots of people in the 19th century in the sciences were thinking about various forms of evolution, or sort of an order to things of progress through time. That's how they saw the natural world. So they saw an age of fishes leading to an age of amphibians, leading to an age of reptiles, where dinosaurs were, and that gave way to an age of mammals and an age of humans. So they saw as basically this onward and upward kind of improvement thing that we know doesn't exist in terms of how evolution works or what it does. Even decades after that, you're getting into the 1920s, 1930s, dinosaurs were great for bringing people into museum halls. That's why you had the second Jurassic dinosaur rush. All these museums like the AMNH, the Field Museum in Chicago, the Carnegie Museum of Natural History in Pittsburgh, sending crews to the West to go dig up big, impressive dinosaurs to put into their museums. They basically were the showstoppers of their time. That's how you got butts in the seats. But the scientists themselves working at those museums, they described the dinosaurs, they'd name them, but it wasn't really a mystery how they lived or where they went. It really was just a matter of like, there's these big weird reptile things. Like the mystery was like why they stuck around so long, basically. A lot of paleontologists, this was before evolution by natural selection was accepted as like the main driver of what makes evolution work. They had all their own ideas, similar to these ideas of progression that, you had reptiles as this kind of holdover state, before mammals took over. So maybe mammals ate all the dinosaur eggs, or they just reproduced better. There had to be some reason why dinosaurs were inferior, basically, because they went extinct. Something must have happened to create this interlude, but it wasn't really worth thinking about. Nobody really was coming up with grand theories of extinction at the time, and that began what paleontologist Michael Benton has called the dilettante phase of dinosaur extinction hypotheses. So basically anybody and everybody who had an idea could throw something out there, and it was always focused on dinosaurs themselves. That was the big, it started to become a mystery. Where did they go? As we started to develop paleontology as a science, you couldn't just avoid the question anymore. So you had people, there was an ophthalmologist, an eye doctor, who thought that all the headgear that you get on things like Triceratops or Parasaurolophus with that long crest, or Styracosaurus, all these horned dinosaurs and hadrosaurs, that they were evolving headgear because the sun was so bright that they would develop cataracts if they didn't have something to shade their eyes, that their horns and crests or things were casting shadows to prevent them from getting basically eye damage from the intensity of the Mesozoic sun. And that obviously doesn't really make sense for a number of reasons. Yeah, an entomologist who suggested as caterpillars that the oldest fossil caterpillars predate the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs. So caterpillars were a new thing in the Mesozoic, he proposed, and therefore they must have just eaten everything. They must have eaten every bit of plant leaf. And the herbivorous dinosaurs no longer had anything to eat, and then the carnivorous dinosaurs passed soon afterwards, and that would neatly and cleanly explain this disappearance. Thing was, by the time we're getting into the 1960s and 1970s, paleontology is like basically entering this computer age, that people are compiling databases. They're starting to collate massive amounts of data. You have huge books that are just full of fossil occurrences for fossil invertebrates, things like, ammonites and trilobites and forams and things like that, stuff that we don't pay attention to a whole bunch. But by looking at what's going on with all these other critters that share the Mesozoic world, share the prehistoric world, they noticed that there were 5 big dips in biodiversity over the past 500 million years or so, one of which was at the very end of the Cretaceous, 66 million years ago. And it wasn't just the non-avian dinosaurs, it was all these different forms of life. More than 70% of known species seem to vanish on land and in the oceans. So talking about caterpillars and things like that, it doesn't make any sense. Talking about diseases amongst the dinosaurs or things like that doesn't make any sense either. You have to account for the whole picture. And seemingly nothing could do it. It wasn't until about 1980 that we had a famous paper published in the journal Science, identifying the iridium spike, that there's this rare metal related to platinum called iridium. It's rarely found in the Earth's crust on its own. Sometimes we see it in basically magma outpourings and things like that, but it's more often found in asteroids, meteorites, basically chunks of rock floating around space. So finding that spike that exists right in that layer, and really only in that layer, between the Cretaceous and the next period called the Paleogene, it indicated that something hit the Earth. Something hit the Earth with such force that it was pulverized, and all those bits were flung all over the planet and became deposited in what we now call the KPG boundary. And there was debate about this for a very long time, but now we know that this was the killer. This is the only thing that we know of that makes sense of the entire pattern. And I can imagine some of you saying, like, well, I've heard about volcanoes and other things. And I will get to that, I think, later in this. The volcanoes have largely been exonerated in terms of their role in this mass extinction. It really was the fact that this massive chunk of space rock hit the planet 66 million years ago, and it fundamentally changed everything. It's the sort of mass extinction that we never thought could happen. It seemed entirely implausible. So the day before impact, if you can imagine it, think about sort of the Gulf Coast of the US today, these sort of conifer populated, swampy kind of floodplain environments, and you'll start to get a picture of what life was like in the environment in which T-Rex and Triceratops lived in Western North America. And that is our best window into this mass extinction. There are other places in the world that we're just starting to understand that have the before and after snapshot. But it's Western North America that really has the best record in terms of just fossil density and everything else to understand what happened, how swiftly it happened. So that's the environment we're going to think about, what's now preserved in what's called the Hell Creek Formation, that spans a large area of Montana and the Dakotas. There are equivalent beds in Wyoming and Utah and Saskatchewan and some other places. But it's the Hell Creek Formation that really gives us our best picture of this. And you have dinosaurs basically at the height of their diversity. And when we talk about dinosaurs, we're not just talking about the reptiles themselves. So this is an illustration of a scratching Edmontosaurus, just taking care of a good itch, because we know dinosaurs have parasites. We know herbivorous dinosaurs, much like herbivores today, must have had microorganisms in their guts that allowed them to break down plant food because they couldn't otherwise do it. That they are a part of ancient landscapes. They're trampling down plants and creating open spaces. They're being hosts for parasitic animals. They're feeding on each other. They're interacting. This is a vibrant, diverse, lush world. There's been some debate over the years about whether non-avian dinosaurs were declining or not as they got to the end of the Cretaceous. There's a whole other reason that we could get into about why that apparent drop occurs. It's mostly because we have fewer rocks from the very end of the Cretaceous than we do for 10 million years prior. 10 million years prior, there are great exposures of 75 million years ago, from Alaska down through Alberta, Montana, Utah, all the way down to Mexico. So you get a really great picture of dinosaur diversity. And when you look at the very end of the Cretaceous, 66 million years ago, that interior seaway that used to exist and split North America in two has largely vanished. Those floodplains that are really great for preserving fossils are much smaller now, much fewer. So we have less of a fossil record during that time. If we had a better fossil record, if we have an equivalent fossil record, we would probably be finding all kinds of new species all across Western North America in the same place. But any apparent diversity dip is really just an artifact of what's left and what we look for and what we find. And there's still new discoveries being made, overall, not even just from this formation, but considering the entire fossil record, a new dinosaur is named on average of every 2 weeks. And it's been estimated that we've only found about a third of what's still out there. So when you think about this time, like really, it's not the world expecting a mass extinction. It's not a world expecting an asteroid strike or things to change. It's, as far as we know, was an average spring day in the Mesozoic, at least in the northern hemisphere. And this is relatively recent research. There's been a lot of controversy about the site this came out of and who's involved, but research by Melanie During and her colleagues, by looking at fossil fish found at a particular fossil site in the Dakotas, they found spherules basically impact debris in the gills of these fish, which indicate that they were filter feeding when they perished. They picked up some of this debris, and those fish showed signs that they were still growing. And these fish, related to sturgeon and paddlefish today, only grow in the springtime when there's lots of food. So this kind of pins down the seasonality of when this asteroid struck. So if you think about this world, not only is it full of things like Triceratops and T-Rex and toothed birds and crocodiles and turtles, it's just, if everywhere you went, you would see life. And this is the time that the asteroid struck. And it wasn't just kind of like hanging out nearby and then dipped in. A study published just a couple of weeks ago really identified where the asteroid came from. So it's a chunk of space rock called the carbonaceous chondrite. It's basically debris left over from the beginning of our solar system, from the origins of our solar system, that didn't get taken up in anything else. The 6-mile wide chunk of rock just kind of floating on the outer reaches of our solar system. And then just through the motions of the planets and the way that gravity and gravitation works, it started to get pulled closer to Jupiter. Similar to what happened to the comet Shoemaker-Levy 9, if you remember that one from a number of decades ago. But basically this pull brought it between the sun and Jupiter and flung it more or less towards Earth. And this is transpiring during the rise and the evolution of the non-avian dinosaurs. And it's kind of terrifying to think about, like, during that entire time period, the thing that was going to end the Cretaceous, that was going to bring an end to what we often call the age of dinosaurs, was already on its way. It was already basically headed on this 1 in a million skill shot. All the different things that miss or come close by or don't hit, or hit in a place that doesn't cause much damage. Like, this was going to be the worst case scenario of all worst case scenarios for life on Earth. From what we understand, the asteroid struck what's now the Yucatan Peninsula, a place called Chicxulub. It was discovered by an oil geologist like back in the 60s. It wasn't identified for what it was until the 1990s. Seemed to hit a low angle, maybe like a 45-degree angle. When it hit, it instantly basically melted the rock around it to the point that the rock was like water. It sloshed around. You had tsunamis that spread out from this area that were so huge. We actually see tsunami damage on the other side of the planet. Basically, it's like this thing shook, for lack of a better term, the crust of the earth. You could feel this thing very far away. It took about less than 20 minutes or so for the first seismic waves to start hitting what's now the Montana and the Dakotas. And in this area, basically Western North America would have felt, so far as we know, the brunt of so much of this. If you're nearby, the immediate devastation was terrible. But the worst part about this was where the asteroid hit, the kind of rock that it hit, and given its speed and angle and all those factors, it created a whole bunch of debris. It basically bust apart into all these little particles, all these little bits of glass and shocked quartz and stone, flung back up into the air, and it started to spread around the planet. And as each of those little things starts to come back down, it creates friction. If you think of like any sci-fi movie you've ever seen, someone's re-entering the atmosphere. When the spaceship starts to hit oxygen and stuff again, it creates friction against the oxygen in the air and the other molecules in there. Get that glowing color on the nose of the spaceship or whatever. So imagine that happening, but to little bits of glass, little bits of rock, all over the planet at such a volume that the friction heats up the air. It heats the air into what we call an infrared pulse to a temperature of about 500 degrees Fahrenheit. So that is what you broil a chicken at. And if you are on the surface of the planet when something like this happens, there's not really anywhere to go. This is so hot that you had dry forest litter spontaneously combust, basically spontaneously burst into flames and start forest fire in addition to all this terrible heat. So if you're a non-avian dinosaur, there's not a whole lot you can do about this. There were no species that we know of that were fully aquatic or lived, entirely in the oceans or in the water, so they can't really use that as a refuge. Many of them are too big to get underground, which we'll talk about in a second, and why that was so important for so many small things, but especially large. And by large, I mean really bigger than about a chicken in size. If you weren't living in the water, you didn't have a way to get underground, there's no way to escape this, that life is not adapted except for extremophile bacteria for conditions like this. So even though growing up I saw all these illustrations of non-avian dinosaurs disappearing over time in this great ash cloud and stuff, most of them likely perished within the first 24 hours of impact because of this heat pulse. It was a faster mass extinction than anyone ever really anticipated. Most prior mass extinctions played out over the course of hundreds of thousands, if not a million or so years. This was less than 24 hours, and you have the Earth fundamentally changed already. And this is just the first punch of two. There was something else about this impact that was extra difficult to handle. On the first day, sort of our relatives and even some of our ancestors were able to survive because they could get to shelter. They could get underground. And we know from modern day forest fires that burn about as hot as some of the temperatures this impact created. If you get about less than a foot, about 10 inches or so underneath the surface of the soil, the heat can't reach down that far. Soil basically insulates a lot of life underground. And this is really important for what's going to happen the next million years following the impact, that everything that comes back, at least on land, had to find some way to get away from this heat. Mammals were already burrowing. We have mammal burrows going back through the Jurassic. So some of them were certainly already underground. You have the seed bank in the soil. So you've had plants over generations leaving seeds and nuts and things like that that are locked in the soil and protected from this heat. So basically the earth is being scorched in every environment all over the planet, but less than a foot underground, life is already surviving. And that's the key to so much of this, why we find so many small species that seem to have made it through and continue to proliferate, while the big ones, the ones that we think of as so powerful and resilient, the things like T-Rex and Triceratops and Montosaurus and Pachycephalosaurus and all our favorites, there was just nowhere for them to go. And this affected, of course, many other forms of life. We lost the last of the pterosaurs, big things like Quetzalcoatlus, these pterosaurs, flying reptiles called Asdarchids, that were the last of their group. There was no way to fly above or out of this. They basically succumbed to the same pressures. We also see the disappearance of many marine reptiles. You had plesiosaurs, you had mosasaurs, these big seagoing lizards. Ocean ecosystems were so affected and collapsed so quickly that basically they had the ecological rug pulled out from underneath them. And part of the reason why has to do with the impact winter that followed that first 24 hours. Sorry, skipping ahead past the croc friend. So the rocks that the asteroid struck were limestone, basically the remains of ancient reefs that formed millions of years ago. And it's kind of wild to think about that during the time that all these creatures that we're talking about were living during the Cretaceous, Earth already had a fossil record. There were fossils of dinosaurs while non-avian dinosaurs were still roaming around. So the asteroid struck this limestone, these fossil reefs. Life makes a lot of sulfur through its processes. And those sulfur compounds, we know from our own activities, when you aerosolize those and you put those in the atmosphere, they're really good at reflecting sunlight. And you don't even have to do it completely. So between the soot from the fires and the debris from the asteroid strike, and now you have these sulfur-based compounds reflecting sunlight back out into space, photosynthesis is curtailed. Sunlight is blocked by at least like 20% over a 3-year period. plants rely on that sunlight for their food, and they form the basis of, not only food for many ecosystems, but oxygen on this planet. And if plants can't photosynthesize, just there's nothing to build up from. Life has to simply get through what we call the impact winter. So they first had to survive the heat, these terrible fires, this terrible heat pulse, and then survive an impact winter that lasted about 3 years. That also created acid rain. Basically, these sulfur compounds not only blocked out the sunlight, but as they get taken up into the way cloud formation goes, it would come back down into acid rain and erase some of the fossil record. Part of the reason that we don't have a great fossil record from this moment where incredible amounts of biomass perished all at the same time is because the acid rain that followed basically ate away at those calcium based bones and shells and things like that. You actually see this in some microorganisms, these crustaceans called ostracods that you see in freshwater environments where their fossil record has a blip basically around the time that this would be happening. And you see the effects perhaps most starkly in the oceans. There's a paper that came out a few years ago about coccoliths, these little discs. They're basically algae discs that form spheres. Before the extinction, you have coccoliths that basically photosynthesize. They rely on that to make their food, and they're everywhere. And you also have these fossils, these coccoliths, that are mixotrophs. So they can photosynthesize, but they can also break down organic material. They can survive if there is not sunlight. After the impact, all the photosynthetic forms basically go extinct, they vanish. It's only the mixotrophs that really seem to survive. So that tells us basically how close Earth came to not a total extinction. There still would have been many forms of at least microscopic life, but the oceans almost went back to a state that hadn't existed in about 500 million years or so. It's like the closest that Earth ever came to having the reset button pressed. This was incredibly taxing for life on Earth, and yet some forms of life survived. As we know from the quote, life finds a way, and birds, our avian dinosaurs, certainly did that. And part of the reason that we've been able to figure out some of how they might have made it through is because at the end of the Cretaceous, you had three forms of organisms that were all very similar to each other. You had small raptor-like dinosaurs, like the Saccharoraptor. You had toothed birds, and you had toothless birds that were already adapted to eating seeds and nuts and plants and things like that. So the more carnivorous forms, basically the raptors and the toothed birds, they had no more food. The extinction was so severe that there's not enough to hunt, there's not enough to sustain themselves. So even if they made it through that heat pulse by going underground, many were certainly small enough to, they wouldn't have had enough to subsist upon. And the fact that it's only beaked birds that survived and set up all our wonderful feathered friends we see around us today basically gives us a big hint that it was eating the seeds and nuts that were basically in the seed bank in the ground that allowed them to survive, that they were able to get enough vegetable material to make it through and continue on as the one dinosaur group that made it. So you have the day of the impact, you have those terrible first 24 hours, you have the 3 years of impact winter, and that dissipates. When could life be said to recover? This is one of the most common questions we have about mass extinctions, is when does life recover? And we could make an argument that it never really has. It's been 66 million years, but we don't have ecosystems the same way that we did in the Mesozoic. Basically having a dinosaur based ecosystem, how they changed the landscape, how they interacted with it, has never been really replicated or replaced in the same way. But you have ecosystems build once again, or start to build again. You have interactions start to form that builds more biodiversity. And the first mark that we see that sort of the worst is likely over is what we call a fern spike. So we have the iridium spike that marks the asteroid impact. The fern spike is about 100,000 years after impact, and you just see fern pollen everywhere. And we know from modern habitats that ferns, they like disturbed habitats. They do well basically in the wake of volcanic eruptions or other things like that. They're these edge species that tend to thrive when things are a little bit disrupted. So that tells us that things are starting to reseed, things are starting to build up again. The survivors are starting to make new ecosystems, and we often see this where the surviving species, they proliferate very, very fast, and they're kind of everywhere. So you have lower biodiversity, a lower number of species, but their abundance goes up. And through, you know, living next to each other, through new interactions, through competition, you start to build new forms of biodiversity again. It starts to build upon itself. Not that the news is 100% good for everybody. One of the things that frustrates me to no end about, our modern world and the fossil records is that we don't have ammonites. We have the chambered nautilus. We have things like crinoids and brachiopods, which these ancient forms of invertebrates that have been, around for hundreds of millions of years. But ammonites, these cool cephalopods that lived in these coiled shells and were everywhere through the Mesozoic in the oceans, they vanish 100,000 years after impact. So they made it through. They made it through the heat pulse. They made it through the impact winter, and they still go extinct. And we think it has something to do with the way they reproduce, that they had very small young, but ammonites also ate plankton. So we think they might have accidentally cannibalized themselves basically into extinction as oceans were recovering. They couldn't hang on long enough. Where nautilus, which are still around, had larger offspring. They had a different natural history that somehow fit this time period a little bit better. So you can have extremely similar organisms and say, like, this one should have made it, but the details are so slight in terms of what made the difference between extinction and survival. And things are not the same, all over the planet. Remember, this is a global extinction. So you have one group of mammals called multituberculates. They're like prehistoric squirrels, more or less. They're named for the complexity of their cheek teeth. They survive the mass extinction, but they get hit pretty hard in prehistoric Asia. And prehistoric Asia around this time, at the beginning of the Paleogene, is when we see the first rodents, things that would have looked similar to mountain beavers, which are still around today. Very similar to multituberculates. If you saw them alive side by side, you'd probably call both of them a squirrel, but only rodents are around now. So even, you know, with a surviving group, there are changes to their distribution, to aspects of their natural history. They're going to set up the next 66 million years. And for many mammals, this is one that we find in ancient Colorado, within about 100,000 years. After the impact, it would have been about the size of like a medium-sized dog or a large cat. They're mostly eating insects. Insects, immediately start to disperse and evolve into old roles. There was a mass extinction of insects, but through convergent evolution, they end up doing some of the same things. They proliferate through a lot of these early forests that are showing up in the Paleogene that have a lot more flowering plants or angiosperms, things like magnolias and dogwoods and palms and things like that. Whereas previously it was conifers, what we call gymnosperms, that were most prolific and most abundant. So forests have fundamentally changed, insects have fundamentally changed, and these new plant groups and these new insect groups are the fuel that are going to allow mammal evolution to take off. Lots of high energy, high protein kind of critters. If we look at even the genes of mammals and go through their evolutionary history, how have these genes changed? Mammals from around this time, mammals, so far as we can estimate from the earliest Paleogene, had multiple copies of what's called a gene that breaks down chitin, creates this enzyme called chitinase. So eating bugs is clearly very, very important. And you don't really see that among as many mammal groups today. Certainly during our ancestry, it's been reduced to one. There are other things that allow us to eat bugs if we want to, but the point is that in the earliest Paleogene, mammals are really eating like some early beans, a lot of bugs, and they're starting to, interact and compete for these resources. And as they do so, some become larger and more carnivorous, like this Eoconodon, which is about the size of a German Shepherd. It's one of the earliest Masonichids, what we often call wolves with hooves. Some become more herbivorous. You have these forests that grow so densely because dinosaurs aren't pushing them over, that they're stratified. So you can have species that live in the canopy and don't really come down, species that live on the ground, species that burrow under the ground, or species that fly. You have basically more ecological space in each square acre in a dense forest than you do in a big open environment where everything's spread out because dinosaurs are constantly pushing over trees. So the fact that there aren't any big mammals allowed forests to grow dense and become this kind of crucible of mammalian evolution, where you get a lot of these sort of dynamics that create what we call niche partitioning. It allows two similar species to basically live side by side. Say if this one eats this particular plant, another species can primarily subsist on another particular plant or move in a different way or be an omnivore or what have you. So from this group of very similar mammals at the beginning, you start to get all these differences and starts to build up again. For years, I remember as an ecology student, it used to be a big question of, why are the tropics so biodiverse? Is it something about the heat? Is it something about the plant life? It's a complicated question with a complicated answer, but one of the things that makes the difference is in things like rainforests, you just have so much basically ecological opportunity that organisms can evolve much more profusely, that you can get lots more critters in the same space. And in fact, we get the very first rainforests within about a million years or so of the KPG impact, even though we often like to think of dinosaurs as moving through these humid tropical jungles like we see in the Jurassic Park films. The fact of the matter is that those rainforests did not exist until the non-avian dinosaurs had all disappeared, and it actually required the absence of the dinosaurs, as well as how the impact changed certain things about the soil cycle, basically infused a whole bunch of iron and other minerals into the surface soil layers that allowed new forms of plants to grow and to grow more densely. So it really was a fundamentally different world than existed in the Mesozoic. This was the beginning of something new. And amongst all this, there's a little critter that was around at the same time as T-Rex that made it through into the earliest Paleocene. We find them in rocks before and after the impact. Get a fit in the palm of your hand. Looked like a tree shrew, and it's called Purgatorius. And this, so far as we've identified, is the earliest known fossil primate. So this is where our story starts, and I think that's fundamentally amazing. What makes this mass extinction not just about what we lost at the beginning of part of our own story, in that we could have basically been erased from the fossil record, from history, if the mass extinction played out a little bit differently. The first primates were already around when the asteroid struck. Somehow they managed to survive, likely by finding some of these places to hide underground. They made it through, and then you just see this profusion of different primate species through the Paleocene, through the rest of the Cenozoic. These are our ancestors and relatives. So basically, our fate is directly tied to this event, and it's kind of a bittersweet moment in that, you know, we miss our dinosaurs, right? I wish I could see a living Triceratops. I wish I could see, what evolution would have done with another 66 million years. There's some great books that have been written about just this. Dougal Dixon has a book that he wrote in the 80s called The New Dinosaurs, full of speculative evolution kind of versions of what life would look like now if the asteroid hadn't hit. But if that were so, based upon how we know evolution works, this idea called contingency, it's the same thing as, like, if you decide not to go out to do something and you miss some big event because you made a decision, whereas if you decided to go to that, you would have been there for it. Um, all these little choices, all these little things that build up over time, we would not exist without this asteroid impact. And I think that's part of the fascination, is that our own story is directly tied to this moment. So it's not just a warning and it's not just a tragedy, but it's really this key moment where our ancestors started to become what they are. So much of primate evolution is based upon what was going on in the trees. The fact that we have forward-facing eyes to gauge distances, the fact that we have grasping hands to manipulate objects and hold on to things. It's all because things like Purgatorius are running around through the branches trying to catch bugs and crunch them. And all those little advantages, those little adaptations that come about from being arboreal were already in place when our hominin ancestors 6 million years ago started to come down from the trees. So if this asteroid impact hadn't happened, forget even about the dinosaurs, but forests were not allowed to be this warm and sort of welcoming place for the earliest primates, our evolutionary history would have been fundamentally different. So that's all that I have for the talk. I'm going to try and look at the channel and see what questions you all might have. I really appreciate you listening to this talk. If you're interested in learning more or getting the detail of this, the book is The Last Days of the Dinosaurs, and that's out now. And then I have another book coming out in February called When the Earth Was Green, all about the interrelationship between animals and plants, and how this world that we see around us came to be through this deep evolutionary romance, as I call it, between different forms of life. So with that, I'm going to stop my screen share and see if I can check out your comments. Okay, I do love the "Oh, Triceratops left the stove on again" comment. That's great. Okay, so I'm scrolling back through. I won't keep people hanging for too long, but if you have a question, if you wouldn't mind repeating it or throwing it in, I'll do my best to answer. Thank you for all the lovely comments. It's while we're waiting, I just want to throw in like why I wrote this book is because like growing up, it always seemed obvious, right? Just an asteroid struck the planet, and mass extinction happens. We know of other asteroid impacts that have happened since this one. There was one that happened about like 50 million years ago or so. That's not tied to a mass extinction. So not every impact is the same. They all do different kinds of stuff, and it's really neat looking back at this history of things. And we're always learning something new. This is not impact related, but you might have seen some paleo art of this on social media in the last week or so that around 400 million years ago or so, ancient, well before the dinosaurs, it's thought that the earth temporarily had a ring around it like Saturn did, basically this debris, and it's being debated right now how accurate this is. But it's neat to think that there are all these sort of processes that involve earth being part of a planet in our solar system that affect life on earth. That's not just what happens here, but that we're part of this much bigger picture. um, for what's my fave paleo creature, well, I think they're watching right now. So some of you might know I'm dating Splash, also known as Retro, Retro the Allosaurus, neon pink and yellow and green Allosaurus. And because of that, I already liked Allosaurus already. But I'm happy to say that I'm dating a dinosaur, so I'd probably say that Splash is my favorite prehistoric creature. But the actual species, yeah, Allosaurus. I have a couple tattoos on the back of my hand. I know it's hard to see in the low lighting, but I've got a fossil sleeve with the Allosaurus on there. Um, in terms of the fossil record of insects that survived, we have fossil insects from some places. In some places we have like ash falls, where it's really fine grained stuff. How a fossil forms. If it's relatively coarse, like sand, it's good for preserving bones and stuff. If it's something that's much finer, like clay or mud or ash, you can get that fine detail that you need to preserve insects. So we have some sites like that. Fossil amber, as well tree resin. There's actually this really neat time, I write a whole chapter about it in When the Earth Was Green, called the Cretaceous Resinous Interval. And it's this time period of over 10 million years in the Cretaceous where you have monkey puzzle trees, all these conifers that are spread all across the planet, and they're just pumping out resin constantly, because whenever these trees get damaged, they exude resin to try and basically keep stuff from getting in there, from closing the gap. And you get insects and debris and all kinds of stuff in there. There's actually been ammonite found in amber. It was a tree that was growing near a beach, and I guess a little ammonite shell was blown by the wind into the resin, or the resin fell on it. So we have, a marine organism in amber, which is really cool. So we have some insects from that as well. But one of the most telling things in terms of like their interactions with the environment that we have is leaf damage. You can look at fossil leaves and you can see where fossil insects have munched them. And that's been really important to working out the KPG mass extinction and what happened afterwards. Is that if you look at fossil leaves from before the impact, they've got all kinds of insect damage on them. So that's similar to what you see today. Leaf miners and beetles chewing on them, and caterpillar damage and all that kind of stuff. Immediately after the impact, the amount of insect damage goes down, suggesting that there's been a mass extinction of those insect species. But insects they reproduce so quickly and they're so diverse. I mean, they're some of the most important organisms on the planet. They evolve so fast to do those same things again that you can actually track ecosystem recovery by seeing when did these leaves start getting damaged again. And that's really useful for figuring out some of this ecology. So the place that we find Titanoboa, the Cerrejón formation in Colombia, that spot, even though it's famous for the snake, was first found because it's a coal mine full of fossil plants. And we actually have a really great representation of what that forest was like, full of insect damage. And again, if you're interested in this kind of stuff, even though it's ostensibly a book about fossil plants, insects play a large role in When the Earth Was Green, and telling a little bit of their story and how plants and insects interacted. Like the Carboniferous, that time where you get things like Arthropleura, the 6-foot long millipede that's moving around the ancient forest floor, and how this was partially allowed by the excess oxygen that so many plants were created, but oxygen was also a problem. So insects had to get big to basically dilute the amount of toxic oxygen. So they have their own fossil history. It's kind of, it's a little bit more sporadic. How the fossil record forms. There's a whole science called taphonomy. That's more or less what happens between death and discovery. And there's a whole science of basically how a fossil becomes a fossil, why we have the fossil record we do. And I think it's amazing, frankly. Going back to the 19th century, you have Charles Darwin writing it on the origin of species, saying, if you think about it like a book, if the fossil record were a book, we're missing entire chapters, we're missing paragraphs, we're missing sentences, we're missing words. It's hard to get the big picture of what was going on. And yet, despite how rare it is for stuff to be fossilized, how rare it is the conditions to be just right for something to enter the fossil record, we have all this stuff. We're finding new stuff every single day that it's, a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of what was alive. And yet it's still here. We can touch it, we can study it, we can start to reconstruct these past worlds, and that's what's so exciting. Is that I love this stuff when I was a kid. I'm 41 now. We're gonna be finding stuff to the day I die and beyond. Like there's always something new that's going to change our picture a little bit, and I really can't wait to see what we find next. Okay, so I think that's it for me. Thank you so much for coming to the talk. I hope you enjoy the rest of your CozyCon. Thank you so much, everybody.